ride with us? Ride with us. Oh yeah. Do you wanna ride with us? Ride with us.
Hey guys, Craig here again from Flying Wheels in Danville, New Hampshire, the auto experts, for part 2 of our LS1 240sx build. Part 1 went through the beginning parts and all the detail of how we got the engine in, what parts we used. Part 2 took us a little while because we were delayed with some other projects. We finally got into our car and got it up and running and ready to race this weekend actually. So what we're going to do today is just go through what we did to get us to this point. If you haven't watched part 1 already, I recommend you watch that before watching part 2. Where we left off at the end of part 1 was our steering column. So I had showed you underneath how to remove the steering column and play with it to get it between the header. At that point, when we ended the video, we were stuck in between the header because I had added some heat wrap. What we did to actually get the steering column through, there's 4 bolts under the dash on the column. We removed those 4 bolts. The headers actually did stay on. I thought I'd have to remove the headers. And we had one guy inside the seat with the steering wheel playing around with it. It was completely movable off of the dash. And the other guy in here wiggling and moving it in between the header until we lined it up with the steering coupler and tightened everything up. Steering column was lined up to the coupler. We had our master technician Fletcher here wire up the power steering hoses. Power steering lines would have been better run while the engine was out. And what we did was use the factory LS1 fuel pump. The smaller line is the small pressure line, and you'll see here the larger hose with the metal fittings is the high pressure line that mounts to the rack. I wouldn't say anything on this project is very simple. However, with the fuel lines, that was one of the easier parts. What we had done was run the factory 240sx fuel line right behind the engine along with the brake lines right to the fuel rail right here, which is under our cover. Fletcher did replace our fuel pump inside the vehicle with a Walbro 255 LPH fuel pump just to provide more higher fuel pressure. We spoke about the dipstick already. The aftermarket dipstick is here from CX Racing, and we have the inlet and outlet from our remote oil filter. And the first mistake we made with the oil filter was with the oil lines. You'll see the CX Racing oil pan down there. Right down there, there's an in and there's an out. We actually crossed the line, so the first time we started, we noticed there was low oil pressure and we started to hear a lifter noise. We shut it off and changed the lines around, and the oil pressure went right back up, so we had crossed the lines originally. The remote filter lines, the front of the oil pan was in from the filter, the back was out to the filter. Like I said, we had very little oil pressure when we first started it. We crossed the lines back, and then everything was fine. So be aware of that. For the ignition, we upgraded the plugs, as well as we went with 10.5mm high performance wires. The wires that we got that said it was for an LS1 didn't quite fit. We ended up needing 3 straights and 5 90-degree boots to fit in here, in between the headers. So if you are replacing your wires, which you are probably going to end up needing to do, make sure that you use a custom kit so you can make some of your own wires. If you're wondering about throttle, the original Nissan 240sx throttle cable will work. It was the right length. It didn't look like it was the right length at first, but we used the stock, what we had, SR20 DET throttle cable bracket. We had used that. I think if we crossed and turned the LS1 bracket upside down too, that would have worked as well. But it will work. It will just take a little bit of playing with and some fabrication to get it to fit. With the wiring, everything we had already wired up to the engine. It was all plug and play. Wiring Specialties made it very easy for us. I disconnected the LS1 harness one by one, plugged the Wiring Specialties harness in right from the other, from the front to the back. It was very simple. Thank you to them for making the project easier with their harness kit rather than trying to figure out splicing and adding wires, figuring out which wire went where. What we had Fletcher do was run the wire from the engine through the firewall over here and hook it into the PCM and the, what was the speedometer controller? Dakota Digital speed controller. That is underneath the dash. And while he was in there, he actually fabricated a little mount for our PCM and the Dakota Digital off to the side so it wasn't just dangling on the floor waiting to be kicked by somebody.
Because we do not use our battery right here where we put our filter and our oil cooler, so this red block right here is what normally goes on to the positive terminal. You just convert it over to here. This green wire that we see right here goes to our remote battery in the trunk. And then this black wire from here goes right down into the starter location. Pretty simple, easy.
One of the mistakes I made in part one that Fletcher caught was quite a headache actually. When I put in the starter was on the LS1, we put the header on and dropped the engine in, and unfortunately I did not wire the starter prior to dropping the engine. So what he had to do was remove the header, get to the starter to wire it up, and then put the header back on. I think, did you have to lift the engine at all to get to it?
Yes.
So we had to loosen the motor mount on the passenger side, remove the header, lift the engine slightly to get to the starter. All of that would have been much easier had we done it prior to installing the engine. While you are in there, the other mistake I made that I didn't mention in part one, very, very important, was with the CX Racing kit, it comes with a, sold separately actually, dipstick tube. It's a custom-made dipstick tube from CX Racing, goes to the driver's side of the oil pan. You remove the old dipstick from the passenger side. What we did not do was fill the hole from where the dipstick tube was. And once we did that, once we didn't do that, we started the engine and it started pumping oil right out of the old dipstick hole all over the starter. A lot of people said that you can't take the header out with the engine in the engine bay. How'd you do it? Just lift it a little bit, right?
Yeah. Took the
Lift
motor,
it a little bit.
took the motor mount bolt out, jacked the motor up to the side a little bit, pulled the header right out.
What we did make this mistake with is you'll see right in here, see that black little circle right there behind the starter? That's where the old oil dipstick was. We forgot to plug the old oil dipstick hole when we pulled the tube out. And what happened was oil shot out all over the starter and ruined the starter. So we had to pull the header off again, put the starter, remove the starter, fill the hole, and replace the starter. Run. Like we said, we ran it through the firewall, plug it into the PCM. We used the Dakota Digital controller for the speedometer. What we did do was make we lengthened the OBD port and attached it right to our center console. That way we can hook our computer into it, get all the readings, and everything's very easily accessible. The speedometer, fuel gauge, everything worked, tachometer, everything worked right from the Wiring Specialties harness. It was nice and easy. The speedometer does need to be calibrated with the Dakota Digital unit. The fuel gauge works, the tachometer works. Our temperature gauge is running high, so it's actually saying that it's hotter than it really is. Once we plug it into our computer with our OBD port right here, it's telling us we're running around 200, 210 when the temperature gauge is showing us much higher. For our Water temp and oil pressure, we just used aftermarket gauges and ran them up to the engine.